Als nächster Referent begrüße ich William Uricchio. William Uricchio hat sehr enge Beziehungen eigentlich zu Deutschland, hat hier an verschiedenen Universitäten Gastprofessuren gehabt, zum Beispiel Marburg und auch Berlin, und hat sich vor einigen Jahren sehr intensiv in einer Studie mit dem Fernsehen im Dritten Reich beschäftigt. Von daher und auch mit dem Kulturfilm, allerdings eher der 10er, 20er Jahre in Deutschland. Das heißt, er ist, glaube ich, ein sehr geeigneter Referent, um das Spannungsverhältnis amerikanischer Stil, deutscher Stil auch aus eigener Anschauung hier zu präsentieren. William Uricchio war lange Zeit in Utrecht Leiter der Abteilung Kommunikationswissenschaft und Film und 7 Jahre. Und ab diesem Sommer ist er sowohl am MIT in Boston als auch weiterhin in Utrecht tätig. Herzlich willkommen, Mr. Uricchio.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be here at the Urania, which is an organization that sponsored the screenings of the Kulturfilm way back in the 1910s, maybe earlier. The sponsorship and the stimulation of especially nonfiction, educational, scientific film from this house and from these houses across Germany is really wonderful. I only want to say a few words for the moment and then talk more properly in a few more minutes just about the film we're about to see. I'm sure many of you saw last evening the film The Plow That Broke the Plains. We're going to see the other big film by the same director, Per Lorentz, a film called The River, made a year later. Like The Plow That Broke the Plains, the film has a bit of a problematic history in the sense that the ending of the film was added on. You might have noticed last evening that suddenly at the end of the film, a lot of information, a lot of facts, and kind of a political push come to the film. That was indeed on the copyrighted initial version of the film, but it was cut off almost immediately. It was not put there. Per Lorentz was in disagreement with it, but for political reasons it was there, and for political reasons taken away. The film we're going to see today is much the same. You're going to follow a sort of a very organic development of the film, and then at the end there will be a short coda that both summarizes but pushes the specific agenda of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, with some stuff on dams. Just a few points to mention. The cinematography in the film is really quite remarkable, and due in no small part to the cinematographers. In this case, Per Lorentz, as in Plow That Broke the Plain, put together a really top team. The team in The Plow That Broke the Plain was probably three of the most important left political filmmakers in America at that time. In this case, what we have are people that are a little more professionally aligned and a little less politically engaged. The Woodward brothers had won 2 Academy Awards for their nature films, and that was one of the reasons he plucked them to shoot on this film. Floyd Crosby, another cinematographer on the film, had picked up an Academy Award for his cinematography in Murnau's film Taboo. And of course Willard Van Dyke, who would go on to become a very important player in the independent documentary movement of the 30s and 1940s and afterwards. Van Dyke was at the beginning of his career, but he had just been working and studying with Edward Weston, and so he brings a very particular aesthetic with him. The music in this film, as last night, is by Virgil Thompson, and again will draw upon American vernacular music. Unlike Benjamin Britten, who's doing a kind of high-blown modernism, which we saw with Coalface, here what we're going to get are elements from American folk tradition interwoven with the score. Like The Plow That Broke the Plain, the production process for this film, and one of the reasons rhythmically that it feels so good, is that the editing process and the composition of the music process occurred together. So there was a very tight interplay between Per Lorentz's supervision of the editing and Virgil Thompson's construction of the score. And I think that fit will be quite evident when you see the film. I think that's all I'll say for the moment. We'll take a look at the film and then talk more generally about, to say my argument in a nutshell, just maybe so you know what to look for. Pere Lorentz has been often, it's a bit of a vogue to be critical of this filmmaker and to say, well, he's a mainstream filmmaker and he's forgotten about the people. He just is interested in a formal beauty and nature. Much of the critique, in a way, that Walter Ruttmann has received for some of his productions. And in a sense, like Ruttmann, indeed, Pere Lorentz is interested, is a formalist, for sure, and is, at least in these two films, not so much interested in people. But what he is interested in is nation. Nation, in a sense, in a very, very physical sense, of earth. If you saw The Plow That Broke the Plain last night, what you saw was a film that's about the loss of land, the earth blowing away, America disappearing in the wind. And what we're going to see in this film is America disappearing in the water, being washed away. It's a very literal sense. The argument, though, that I want to make is that it's, on the one hand, we have this very tangible sense of earth, but on the other hand, what we have is the construction of a new vernacular, a new vocabulary that America will see itself through. I think the primary mission and the primary success of Pere Lorentz, quickly said, is that he was fundamental in establishing a national public culture. He didn't do this alone, but it's an incredible mission, and it's what I want to focus on in my comments. So let's take a look at the river. Back in 1984, when I lived in Berlin, there was a wonderful 14-part series that the Stiftung Deutsche Kinemathek presented at Kino Arsenal of American films, social movement films, focused heavily on the 20s and 30s. This was a 52-film series, covered the whole spectrum of films that this is but one of. I mention that because this is a fairly complex area, and to reduce it to something like 20 minutes is tough. Added to that, I have a certain guilt factor. When I studied at New York University, it was my privilege to study not only with people like Brian for a short time, but also with people like Jay Lida, Leo Hurwitz, George Stoney, Willard Van Dyke, people that were very active in this period as filmmakers. And the nuance and the complexity of the period that I learned through them is something that will not come through in my comments. So while I can't do justice to this complexity, what I do want to do is zoom in on a particular sort of argument. As I suggested before the film, what we have from the late 20s through the 30s is a period of real crisis in America. Not just economic crisis, but a crisis in the vision of what is the United States, a hegemonic crisis. Now, Gramsci is important in my thinking about how the world works. And if you think back on Gramsci's theory of society, he sees two basic forces that hold things together. On the one hand, we have political authority. We have the police or the army. When the system breaks down, the police, the military are called in to establish order for the dominant classes. But the preferred model is hegemony, a system of consent whereby people, for various reasons, basically share in the same vision. You don't need the police quite as much. Life seems to go on at a happier pace. What happened in the late 20s and 30s, and especially under the Hoover administration, was that there was a crisis, a collapse in the hegemonic order, which was to say that the police and the army were routinely called out to maintain control of labor situations, of urban situations. Obviously, the system didn't work. And the great trick or the great wonder of the Roosevelt administration, starting in 1933, was to recast the vision of America, was to establish a new diagram, a new vision, a new image, in order to encourage a kind of consent within the hegemonic model. And I want to argue that the films of Pere Lorentz are central in that and that new vision plays out in the formation of what, for the first time, I mean, America has had a media culture for a long time, but this period in the 1930s represents the first time that we can talk really about a national public culture. Obviously, the documentary movement is but one of many manifestations of this national public culture. While one might be tempted to consider Hollywood as part of this, I would argue that largely speaking, it's outside of it, with the exception of a few films like The Gold Diggers of '33, Preston Sturges' Sullivan's Travels, King Vidor's Our Daily Bread. With the exception of those few films, most Hollywood films stood outside the project of the construction of this national public culture. But we could look to other media and find very good examples of it. We could look to photography, for example, and the work done for the FSA, the Farm Securities Administration. We could look at the project for public sculpture in America. We could look at the, if any of you go to old American post offices, you'll see murals that date from this period. There were a large number of public works in the form of city parks, bridges, still standing that are manifestations of this attempt to rebuild, to re-engage America. Obviously, the Tennessee Valley Authority is a remnant of this period. What I'd like to do is sketch out four different, we might call them contexts or vectors, that locate the project of this film, and with it the project of, I think, a significant part of the documentary movement in the 1930s. I want to talk a little bit about the changing infrastructure for media in the 1930s, the reorientation of partisan political discourse. The word administration shows up an awful lot in the 1930s, and it's certainly a period of administrative culture, but in a very specific way. I also want to mention some of the representational changes, the construction of a new vocabulary in writing, in music, and in visual media. And finally, talk a little bit about the filmic, or the cinematic context, the place within documentary culture that a film like this occupies. Just to first mention the media, the position of national media. Leo Seltzer was a pretty significant filmmaker in the Workers' Film and Photo League. And in looking back on the 1930s, when he was very active in film, in an essay he wrote in the 70s or 80s, do I have the quote here? No. But he says something that's quite remarkable. He talks about the big problem that the workers' movement had in the 30s of being a problem of communication. That strikers in one particular vicinity, or starving farmers in another vicinity, or coal miners being exploited somewhere else, had no idea that these were problems that could be shared with people in the next states, let alone throughout the nation. There was no awareness beyond what local newspapers provided. The newsreel circuit in cinema was largely filled with fluff, stories about dogs, stories about fashion shows. I mean, not serious, critical political issues. Radio was largely controlled and did not give space for these kind of events. There was really no forum to let people know that their individual community problems were problems of a bigger scale. And the work, for example, of the Film and Photo League was precisely to do what Dziga Vertov had attempted in the Soviet Union, was precisely to have workers communicate with farmers across states, across the country. So one of the interesting things is that despite having an infrastructure for national communication, there was no deployment or critical use of that infrastructure to inform people about what was happening. There was a kind of fragmentation. This is something the Roosevelt administration addressed in very specific terms. Perhaps you've heard of the fireside chats that Franklin Roosevelt was famous for. This was his attempt to bind together the nation by talking through problems. And it was, I think, a fairly significant attempt to use the radio medium as part of a centralized vision. This is something that's quite strong in Germany in the same period. The notion of using radio to construct a new Volkskörper, to unify the people around particular issues, whether they're political issues or social issues. But for the first time in America, this was being deployed by the Roosevelt administration. If we look at film, which we'll come to in a minute, the efforts of the Film and Photo League or Frontier Films, or the efforts of the Roosevelt administration, which we see with The River, again, were attempts to break out of the ghetto that these kind of independent film movements were put in by the film industry. The film industry was remarkably hostile to these films. The film industry did not want to give Pere Lorentz stock footage to use. Lorentz was quite a critic of the film industry, and in particular a critic of the Hays office. It resulted in a sort of non-cooperation on the part of the industry. It was difficult to get these films shown. So what happened was alternate film circuits developed, alternate ways of distributing, alternate ways of exhibiting, and finally getting some of the films made it actually to theatrical distribution. The point, though, is that again, in the Roosevelt administration, and actually before it a little bit, there's an attempt made to offer an alternate means of film distribution and exhibition. If we think about photography, again, we have a medium that has been around almost for 100 years by this point, but a medium that finally in the 1930s takes a strong advocacy role. Yes, certainly there are predecessors for this, but finally in the 30s, the government begins to sponsor photo documentation projects. There are publications of these projects. Let us now praise famous men. The Walker Evans and AG production went around quite a bit. So the point is photography becomes used in a socially engaged form, but more importantly, starts to manifest itself in the photo essay. The rise of photojournalist magazines like Life and Look occurs in this period. Finally, music. The 30s is the period, late 20s, 30s, is the period when things like country and Western music are, to a certain extent, invented. I mean, there's certainly a vernacular tradition around, but that's codified, given form, both by the recording industry, but especially by the radio industry. And what's interesting there is that, again, we see a kind of countervailing force, not just what the dominant industry, the Hollywood of music, is producing, but a kind of bottom-up penetration of the radio medium and the recording medium. So the 30s is it's a very interesting period in terms of the use of these national media in ways that they haven't been used before. The point is that what we see in the 30s is an active use of existing media infrastructure for purposes of a national culture. We see an embrace of the media's ability not just to define customers, not just to define a marketplace, which of course is the American paradigm, but rather to embrace citizens and to talk more broadly in terms of the public sphere. Okay, media. Let's shift over to the political order. Obviously, the economic crisis of the late 20s and early 30s generated significant political activism. That's a period when we can say that a lot of the working force in America, at least workers' leadership and intellectuals, although there's variations in their notion of leftism, they basically embrace much the same critique. The Roosevelt administration, to a certain extent, drew upon these left-wing impulses, organized them, tempered them a little bit, repackaged them, but basically drew heavily on them. One of the things I think that's remarkable about the Roosevelt administration is its experimental nature, its willingness to try a lot of different things. And Roosevelt himself said, and this is a quote from Roosevelt during his campaign, "It's common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." And if we look at the administration and the countless different organizations that they produced, endless little alphabet terms, the RA, the FDA, there's countless sort of alphabet soup of organizations, we can see that many of these collapsed quickly, but that there was an incredible innovative spirit, and things like we're just seeing here. The sponsor of this film, for example, went out of business quite quickly, but was one of these attempts by the Roosevelt administration to use national authority to intervene. So maybe what's most important to know about the Roosevelt administration is that it has a strongly centrist vision. This is quite, again, unique in American history. This is the first time that the federal government a small group within the federal government is doing everything from organizing stock trading practices to how much land a farmer can cultivate. They intervene on virtually every level: housing problems, nutrition problems, education problems, worker regulations, Social Security. For the first time, the government, the central government, intervenes in sectors where they'd never before been present. So we have a couple of key things here with this political regime that dominates the 30s. We have a highly centralized government authority, national authority. We have the government seeing itself as a protector, the protector of ordinary people, and a source of vision. The government sees its function as constructing a vision. It's a very self-conscious part of this regime. The Roosevelt administration was the first administration to recognize the right of workers to strike. Until the Roosevelt administration, the National Army was frequently called in to stop strikes. And under Roosevelt, workers were given the right to organize, and workers took advantage of it. By 1935, something like 35% of the organized workforce was on strike in the United States. There's also a shift in the Roosevelt administration to collectivity, a shift away from the kind of the dominance of the individual, which is the individual has resumed his or her role in the United States, but during this period, a strong move towards collectivity, a sense of social responsibility. Finally, one of the most striking things in the Roosevelt administration is a commitment to public arts. The largest public art program ever in the United States history occurs in this period, with the government sponsoring something like 10,000 different artists between 1933 and 43, with a kind of a paradoxical notion of culture. On the one side, the administration accepts an elitist notion of high culture, that culture elevates, that culture is good for people. And on the other hand, the government is committed to a democratized notion of culture, that culture should be accessible to everyone, but also that the language of culture, it's not just that culture has to be physically accessible to people, not just keeping museums open longer, but also making sure that the art speaks to the people, that there's a vernacular. So again, this is something that if we look at Germany and if we look at the Soviet Union in the same period, we see similar policies, a redefinition of aesthetics to be for the ordinary people. And obviously this has complications for modernism, which is viewed as somehow apart from, too abstract, too complicated, and results in a certain shift towards a kind of a realist discourse. Okay, if we use this then to shift over to the third contextual point I want to make, the area of representation. What we see in this period in the 1930s is the emergence of a new American vernacular, a new way of Americans seeing themselves and expressing themselves. And it's a very self-conscious vision, it's a crafted vision, has state authority behind it. There's a wonderful quote from Roosevelt on this topic. He says, "The people of this country were taught by their writers and by their critics and by their teachers to believe that art was something foreign to America and to themselves, something imported from another continent and from an age which was not theirs, something they had no part in except to see it in a guarded room on holidays and Sundays. But recently, they have discovered that they have a part. They have seen rooms full of paintings from Americans, walls covered with all the paintings of Americans, some of it good, some of it not good, but all of it native, human, eager, and alive, all of it painted by their own kind, in their own country, and painted about the things they know and have looked at often and have touched and have loved." It's a remarkable utterance from the political leader of a country about the construction of a national aesthetic. One of the claims I think that can actually be made about America in this period is that there's a national socialist democratic workers' party. Not in the same sense that we would talk about the NSDAP, but all those same markers work in their American translation. So the similarities that we see in the project of public film And even in some of the vocabulary of public film, not surprisingly, there's a lot of similarity between the projects what is happening in Germany and the projects in the States. The visual style, and I guess I have to speed up here, the visual style that we see in the States emerges from what in America is called precisionism, but it's very similar to what in Germany is called die neue Sachlichkeit. There are differences. But in America's case, what we see is a blending of this precisionism, which began with a sort of investigation of industrial culture. We see a merger of that with agricultural and rural culture, with vernacular tradition. So we find the sort of purity of surface, the cleanness of surface applied to agricultural models. And what we saw in this film is really exemplary of that new vernacular style that's emerging in America. But there's also a new literary life form that exists in this period, whether it's people like William Carlos Williams in high culture, or people like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler in more popular culture. And of course in music, as I already mentioned. And Virgil Thomson's score draws heavily upon this new musical national language. Finally, I just want to mention parallel filmmakers and parallel film movements. The Per Lorentz film we saw, and the one you saw last night, is, from a certain perspective, centrist. People even like Paul Rotha were very critical of Lorentz because he failed to have humans and failed to show the human condition. The initial film crew on The Plow That Broke the Plane, people like Leo Hurwitz and Paul Strand, were very critical of the film because they felt that Lorentz failed to point his finger at evil individuals, that he failed to point to the contradictions of capital in a specific way. But I think Lorentz's project points his finger in a very unmistakable way. At least has a very strong nod in that direction. But obviously, these films are being made in a context where nonfiction production is particularly strong on the left. And this is a film that, in a sense, brokers the critique of the left with a more centrist position, a more neutral position. Now, one can see that as a weakening of what is, in fact, a very hard critique in the left-wing films that I'll mention in a minute. What I'd like to argue is that it's not so much a weakening as a transcending, an attempt to do something a little bit different, which is to plot out this common space of representation, this common new vision of a national culture. But to go back to the more leftist tradition of films in this period, this is a period when we have particularly interesting set of developments by the Film and Photo League, a project largely inspired by Soviet film production generally, and the work of Dziga Vertov, I think in particular, where the idea is that film should be, that filmmakers are workers, that these workers are playing an active interventionist role in ongoing struggle. Workers are part of this, film workers are part of the struggle. And one can see just in the titles of these films, for example, workers' newsreels, as opposed to the sort of fluff newsreels that dominated, or the Ford Massacre, or the National Hunger March, or a film, I don't know if its title will make sense here, Pie in the Sky. Pie in the Sky is, if you wait long enough, it's going to be yours someday up there in the sky. These are films that speak to the very tangible, active, interventionist struggle that left-wing filmmakers were involved in. And I'm thinking here of people like Leo Hurwitz or Seltzer or Strand, Jay Lyda to some extent. This was the film context, the documentary context that someone like Per Lorentz, in a sense, it's hard to say he came out of it, but he was heavily informed by it. These films, of course, continued to be produced while films like these government films we've just seen were going on. Frontier films continued the good work. And if you've seen films like Native Land, for example, I mean, you see really films in a sense in the direction that Lorentz is going in, but far sharper in the critique, really making it an explicit point to link the struggle of black and white people, of men and women, of workers and farmers. These are interventionist films. This is also a period where, not so much in terms of explicit left political agenda, but we also have a kind of more, again, a more liberal centrist project of sponsored films. A lot of the work that someone like Willard Van Dyke was involved in, The City, for example, sponsored by the American Institute of Planners, or Valley Town, which the Alfred Sloan Foundation paid for. Again, films that are socially interventionist, but in a softer way than the Film and Photo League stuff. These films constituted a network, I would argue, a network in terms of representation, a network in terms of social critique, that films like The Plow That Broke the Plain and The River played off. It's not that a film like this existed in a vacuum. It existed in a framework where there was a strong leftist critique. And this film had a choice of either replicating that critique or of operating on a different wavelength. And obviously, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that it was for the Resettlement Administration, it chose the latter. But again, the point is that we have a community of filmmakers here, and those filmmakers that were most active on the left, and even people active in the center, were called upon to make this particular film. So, as I said at the beginning, two of the things I want to stress about this film is that on the one hand, its notion of nation, its notion of America is quite literal. It's land, it's dirt. We're watching America being washed away through the sort of silly practices of the past, but as well as the sort of economic advantage, the economic exploitation that's taken its toll, both in terms of The Plow That Broke the Plain and in terms of the river. But we're also seeing the recasting of America in very particular visual, acoustical terms, in very specific textual terms. The absence of people in this case is kind of an interesting one. I think the film can maybe be faulted for it, but I think there was a critic who talked about this film and said, yeah, of course people are missing, but if we look at Lorenz's project, what we're seeing is the land, in The Plow That Broke the Plain, water in the case of the river, and the next film of this trilogy about American nation is, of course, the people. And of course, that's the film that we're missing, but it's an intriguing idea in terms of mapping out Per Lorenz's own notion. Roosevelt played an active role in stimulating the production of these films. These were films made in relatively tough conditions, both in terms of budget, in terms of political infighting, and Roosevelt personally intervened at a couple of key points to get this out there. Again, I think consistent with his own project of a national culture. Maybe just a few other things to mention. This is a film, both of these films, let's say Plow That Broke the Plain had an extremely difficult time getting onto screens. It was actively blocked by the Hollywood industry, and only an incredibly strenuous and labor-intensive campaign by Lorenz and by the people in the RA were able finally to get this thing shown in a few key theaters to generate some good press, and ultimately it was shown somewhat. But The River had a somewhat different treatment. The river was far more widely embraced, in part because those disaffected members of Hollywood, people that included King Vidor, but that also included Walt Disney of all people. Walt Disney, with the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, recommended that the river be shown as part of the program, and that helped it gain some attention. Per Lorenz was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for the script for the film. He originally wrote an essay for McCall's magazine, and he wrote it in two forms. He wrote sort of a wordy 5,000-word essay, and he thought, this is a bit much for McCall's readers. So he also wrote a poetic version of the text and sent both into McCall's. The editor took the poem, and the poem, in fact, is most of the text that we hear in the film. This is a film that also did rather well in Europe, and one mark of that is its success at the Venice Film Festival, where it won Best Documentary in 1938. Now, if you read American sources on this, they're quick to point out that this is the same year that Leni Riefenstahl's Olympiad was entered in the documentary category. Leni Riefenstahl's film, though, won Best Picture overall in the 1938 Venice Festival. But this film, won Best Documentary. It's also a film that has an interesting television history. It was shown in 1938 on British television and was one of the few revenue sources, actually, that Pere Lorentz had for the film. So it was blocked by industry. It was blocked by political partisanship in the United States. This is a film that was released at a moment when the Republicans were quite aggressive in their attack on the Roosevelt administration, and in particular on the sponsoring agency for this film, which they saw as a communistic organization. If you recall the end of the film that you saw last night, that's an ending that was cut off almost immediately after it was produced. That was used as evidence of the Roosevelt administration's complicity with communism, this building of collective, farming collectives and communities. And in fact, the New York Times talked about it as specifically being based on the Russian model. And one of the curious things with these films is that although they borrow from Russian film vernacular, Soviet film vernacular, in terms of montage structure, the tank and the tractor sequence, for example, or the cow and the collapse of the stock market versus the cow skull and the stock market image in the plow. That was missed in a way by critics. What critics saw was the more explicitly partisan, what they saw as what Republicans viewed as communistic, which could be almost anything. It was also blocked by regional interests in the United States. The state of Texas saw the films as too depressing and too critical of their state agendas, and so they tried to ban it. But again, the press loved it. So I guess the bottom line that I'd like to leave you with here is that although these films have often been subject to critique as being sort of politically soft, disengaged from the public, in fact, their project is quite a different one, and that project is part of this redefinition of media in the 1930s, this redefinition of the state's role in the 1930s, and in particular, the redefinition of a particular image, set of images, a set of words, and a set of sounds that are used to construct the idea of America. And that's really the success of this film. Thank you.
Yes, I found it very interesting what you said in your lecture about trying to form or find a new vernacular. But I think one should add that, of course, that was not the first try to do so, and not for nothing, like Paul Strand drew heavily, for example, on Walt Whitman. And if you see on the visual level, maybe even the Hudson River School, they were just remembering that there were in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, there was this first try to form a nation via the media, be it in word, like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass or the Hudson School there. And I think they borrow a lot from these people. I found, for example, the commentary, the poetic commentary, which I found beautiful, owes a lot to Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in that content.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think two things. One, Walt Whitman is clearly the reference here. And there's a sense in which Whitman's project, Whitman is, I think in American literary terms, probably the key modernist poet. And he's resuscitated in a very strong way at the beginning of the 20s. And the film that Paul Strand worked on with Charles Sheeler, Manhattan, explicitly repositions Whitman. And of course, yeah, the Luminists, et cetera. There is, of course, a tradition of an American vernacular. The difference here is the sense in which it's cross-platform. The sense in which, number one, it has government agency behind it, sort of selecting what that vernacular will be and selectively promoting it. And number two, making sure that this imagistic form, this imagistic style, is not limited to the world of high art, as it was, say, with the Luminists, but rather that it boils down to a kind of democratic level, that it shows up in the kinds of photo essays that the government stimulated the production of, that it shows up in film form, that it shows up in projects. What the government had at its disposal, thanks to this Works Project Administration, were thousands of intellectuals and artists who they could, in a sense, put to work going out and collecting folk music, going out and sort of putting together anthologies of American literature, going out and documenting in a very particular way, photographically, this the state of America. So it's that project of formalizing a vernacular, I guess, that makes the difference here. But you're absolutely right. There has, of course, been a long tradition of American difference in aesthetic production. Yeah.
Yes, Bill, you made a very good case, both for the 30s being crucial in defining modern America, and also your emphasis on the land. Nonetheless, I feel, for the reasons you've given, your own background at NYU, you're extraordinarily generous to this moment in some specific ways, because you're talking about the land, as you say, as the basis for Para Lauren's vision of America. But of course, the thing that is totally missing is land ownership. And it's very striking how a consensus is built in this film, in particular around the pronoun we. We made the war, we overfarmed, we had to leave for the West. Now, today, of course, that kind of we is inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable. And the poetry, things that people always mention about the different trees and the different rivers. I was just thinking while I was watching it again, what this film would be like if instead of the names of all the rivers, you had the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts. And that would, that's just, slightly polemical to indicate what other lists one could make in order to create a sense of America in the 30s. That's one issue. I'm not sure that you want to respond to that, because you've actually made very explicit that you were aware of all these political criticisms. But maybe another thing that I could just briefly ask you about, and that is that yesterday I was making an argument of a slightly different kind. I was looking at not the Para Lawrence film, but the Flaherty films of a little bit later, The Land, and I was comparing it to Grapes of Wrath. And I was arguing that, contrary to what we hear and read about, and in some sense what you reconfirmed, in my view, I think that Zanuck and Ford could allow themselves to be much more radical than Flaherty making a film for government agencies.
Sorry, the last bit, they had
more radical. Politically, Grapes of Wrath is a more radical film than The Land. The concessions that The Land has to make to its sponsors are actually greater than Ford had to make towards Zanuck and the box office.
Yeah, I think Ford, of course, has the advantage of being of making The Grapes of Wrath at a moment when the economy is on the upswing. It's 39, and
The Land is 42.
Okay, but by that point, it's late 41, as I recall, and of course it's a very crucial period because the economy is on the upswing thanks to war. It's a war-stimulated economy by 39, but by late 41, it's also there's a sort of swing back in terms of national identity thanks to potential engagement in war. So I think the notion of playing with national symbols becomes very touchy at moments of public reconsolidation and war. So I think there the timing is actually quite. 39, you could get away with murder, and 41, 42, the belt was starting to tighten in terms of expressive latitude, potentially. But that's something, only a theory. In terms of the inclusionist we, that's a good point, and I think it speaks precisely to Per Lorentz's agenda here, which was on the one hand to point the finger. I mean, he tells us here that he talks about an ever-increasing percentage of farmers losing control of their land. He talks about the rise of sharecropping and the fact that he gives a few statistics to tell us how many farmers are being, in a sense, disenfranchised. Certainly in The Plow That Broke the Plain, he also gives us some numbers about the fact that land is being taken away. But this film is a remarkably inclusionist film. For example, when you look at how he does this little quick gloss of history, and he needs to say that the Civil War was a kind of turning point, a nodal point in terms of land use. And how do you reference the Civil War in a way not to alienate either the South or the North? And he's found a very elegant solution using the general of the Southern Army, Lee's surrender speech, which is a poignant and touching speech. You can nod to it, but at the same, he can sort of point to it, but at the same time be quite inclusionist for both Southern and Northern audiences. So I guess my point is simply that at this moment, this would have not have served the institutional interests behind the film to start talking about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. I mean, this is a moment where the Roosevelt administration is trying to consolidate power. There's an election coming up within a year, so they're definitely not looking to irritate the power brokers in America. But at the same time, I think the film is also quite clear. Maybe it says we, but I know that I wasn't the one that, I think most of us know who owns the lumber and who owns the resources, who owns the coal. So I find it, again, it's a point that we can be critical of, or one that we can sort of situate within the discourse of the time, which would suggest that, yeah, this is a soft way of making a hard point.
I just want to follow up on that. First of all, I think it's very important to bear in mind the fact that it's not all we, it's the nation. It's really interesting, the different voices that he uses. Also, I only got the microphone so I could say the Wachita, the Wichita, the Yellow, and the Gazoo. But the point about the lists are, to be serious, that there are different voices all the time, aren't there? And that it isn't always the a we, and in fact, on the contrary, it is a passive voice, and that's illustrated by the fact that Lorenz himself was at odds with the crew on Plough, and there's a wonderful story in Variety where they were threatening to walk off the picture, and years later, in giving an interview to Collier's, Lorenz says, I don't know, they wanted to talk about capitalism, and I thought it was about a dust storm, which I think sort of sums up the fundamental political position, don't you think? And the poetic language, I think you're right. It is Whitman-esque in that sense, and the pictures are, in that tradition, which I'm not sure it's the Seven, but I think it's certainly Adams and that particular sort of vibrant social realism. But my feeling, I suppose, my question is that is really to do with the fact that this didn't work. There was a sort of rhetorical stroke going on in all of those films. There's a wonderful thing, the one that Paul Robeson does the commentary for. I'm having another senior moment, so I've forgotten it. Where he says, "There's a
is that
beautiful
Native Land? Is that? Or?
Which one? It was not. It was the one with the dramatic, the agent provocateur as the union organizer that Hurwitz made.
I want to say Native Land, but.
Yes, it's Native Land. Of course, it's Native Land. I'm sorry, I really lose it. Where there's this great sentence about this is happening in 100 cities and 1,000 towns, all that business. 100 cities, 1,000 towns, blah blah blah. Morning in America, which of course Reagan then uses as a campaign slogan, and really there's a sort of even a right wing possibility about the inclusivity of the rhetorics. I think the rhetorics are really very complicated and are far more intuitive, if you will, in that sense, rather than a particular coming from a particular position. And I think it is wrong to actually suggest that there's an inclusive we. And he is a West Virginian. I've always thought the South bit is because he's a West by God Virginian, so they were in the middle, as it were.
Well, it's true. But what I'm hearing is a contradiction, because the inclusivity is there in his naming of locations and cutting across occupations, and let's say he takes rather great pains to sort of paint with a broad with a complex palette. Yet it has the same ambiguity that the we has for Roosevelt. These fireside chats are actually quite interesting as rhetorical strategies in terms of trying to bind together a very divisive, an ideologically polarized nation. And I guess the good news in the American case was it happened to be a somewhat left-of-center regime doing this, as opposed to the German situation where it was, sort of extreme right position from which to be inclusion. But I grant you that inclusivist strategy is always quite a dangerous one, because it tends to suppress opposition. Yeah.
Ich würde sagen, eine letzte Frage noch von Herrn Zimmermann. Noch eine letzte.
Ist eigentlich mehr eine Beobachtung, aber vielleicht auch eine Frage an Bill. Okay, I speak English. What strikes me is if I see the films in comparison of the different countries, I have the impression that they have one in common. They ignore social differences and construct organism metaphors, like the river, like the coal mining, like the night mail, like Blut und Boden, like everything else, which shows we are one unity, we are one people, we are one nation. And they ignore, as Thomas Elsässer just said, they ignore really the social differences. And I think the films, indeed in the 30s especially, they take part in a crisis management. And behind it is the world economic crisis of the late 20s. The state intervention tries to give the nation in every country, Western country, a new vision. Roosevelt in Great Britain too, and in Germany with the Nazi Party too. And they use in their film language, they use similar, they ignore the dialectic of the historical process, and they show the organistic community of the people, of the Volksgemeinschaft. What do you call Volksgemeinschaft in Germany? Hitler's specific topic. This was in a way international propaganda, and that's a big similarity between all these films in comparison, I think. I don't know if you have the same impression. You know the German Kulturfilm very well.
Yeah, and what I would say, I mean, let's say